7 days of suffocating silence in my own home. It all began with a slammed door after Tuesday's dinner. No warning, no argument. Just a sharp, final sound that cut through the air and left behind a void. Since then, every good morning I offered was met with a turned back, every question swallowed by her silence, answered only by the sound of retreating footsteps. At first, I panicked, thought something awful had happened. I scrolled through her social media, called her friends, even reached out to her mother. But the responses were the same. She seems fine to us. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about miscommunication. This was about control. I never claimed to be a mind reader. Yet somehow, 3 years into marriage, I was expected to intuit the invisible line I'd crossed. Was it staying late at work? Missing a comment about a new throw pillow? Breathing too loudly during her shows? By the third day, I gave up guessing. The rejection stung, day after day, like salt rubbed into a wound. I started cooking alone, sleeping in the guest room, moving through the house like a ghost. The silence had a presence now, almost human, hovering, expanding, feeding on the space between us while my patience thinned to threads. On the 5th day, I caught her watching me from the kitchen. As our eyes met, she looked away, but not fast enough to hide the flicker of something in her gaze. Satisfaction. She was enjoying this, testing me, seeing how far I'd bend under the weight of her silence. That night, scrolling through old contacts, I saw a name that sparked warmth through the cold: Alexandra. We'd grown up together, dated briefly in college. Her laugh was magnetic, her presence effortless. My wife had met her once, at a reunion, and immediately bristled. Stay away from that woman, she'd warned. I had to keep the peace, like I always did. But now, on the 6th day of being invisible, something cracked open in me. Alexandra had reached out weeks ago, just passing through, she said. Drinks, for old time's sake. I'd declined, too careful, too cautious. Her message still sat in my inbox. The house around me was quiet, save for the soft murmur of her favorite show from the living room. I started typing. Still in town? I'd love to catch up tomorrow night. When I hit send, something shifted. For the first time in months, I felt the spark of control over my choices, over my life. If she wanted silence, fine. But I wouldn't sit quietly anymore. Alexandra replied almost instantly. Thought you'd never ask. The craftsman at 8? I smiled, really smiled. A foreign feeling after a week of walking on eggshells. I glanced toward the living room where my wife sat, face lit by her phone screen, pretending I didn't exist. Perfect, I typed. Looking forward to seeing you. The next morning, I woke lighter. Day 7, and I wasn't dreading it. I showered, shaved with precision, and reached for the cologne I reserved for special occasions. As I buttoned my shirt, I caught my reflection, smiling. Tonight wouldn't be about her games. It would be about reclaiming myself. All day, Alexandra's messages lit up my phone. We joked about college pranks, traded life updates, flirted in that soft, electric way that danced on the edge of something more. No caution, no guessing, just flow. Remember that night at Lake Morrison? She texted. Of course I did. Moonlit swimming, her laugh echoing over water, the kiss on the dock. A memory untouched by time, untarnished by silence. That evening, I returned home. My wife stood in the kitchen, making dinner, for one. Her performance of indifference was near perfect. 7 days of silence, and still no explanation. No reckoning. I walked past her to change. She hovered outside the door, curious. Sensing a shift. Noticed I wasn't pleading, wasn't breaking. For the first time in a week, I wasn't the one begging for peace. But not today. When my phone chimed with another message from Alexandra, I made no effort to hide it. I left it unlocked on the bed as I changed shirts, perfectly in view of the hallway. She was standing right there. Alexandra had sent a selfie from the bar, red dress, that magnetic smile that always turned heads. Can't wait to see you. Like old times. When I turned around, my wife stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp with silent questions, her jaw tense. Still, not a word. Silence, her chosen weapon, her favorite form of control. Fine. I was done playing. Don't wait up, I said, breezing past her, a trail of cologne hanging in the air between us. In the hallway mirror, I caught her expression, confusion, yes. But this time, laced with the first flicker of doubt. The drive to the craftsman was quiet, giving me space to think. Was this petty? Maybe. But after years of punishment over invisible infractions, something had to break. A relationship built on silence and control isn't love. It's war by other means. When I arrived, Alexandra was already there, commanding the space like always, a cluster of admirers orbiting her. But the second she saw me, her face lit up. She stood, embraced me, and for a moment, time rewound. "You look amazing," I said, meaning every word. "You don't look so bad yourself," she smiled, taking me in. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd show." There was a challenge in her voice, the kind that reminded me who I used to be. The man she knew wouldn't have tolerated what I'd allowed myself to endure. Somewhere along the way, I'd surrendered too much just to keep the peace. "People change," I said, signaling the bartender. "Then sometimes, they change back." 3 drinks in, she leaned closer, her hand resting gently on my arm, her perfume wrapping around my senses like memory itself. Then, buzzing. My phone, insistent in my pocket. 5 messages. "Where are you? Who are you with? Why aren't you answering? Hello? Pick up milk on your way home." The last one nearly made me laugh. After 7 days of silence, she broke it with a grocery list. I slid the phone back into my pocket without replying. "Everything okay?" Alexandra asked, noticing the shift in my expression. "Better than okay," I said. "But maybe we take this conversation somewhere quieter." She raised an eyebrow. "Your place?" I nodded, finishing my drink. "Exactly." The drive home felt electric. Her perfume, the low hum of the engine, her hand on my thigh. I slowed down, wanting to stretch this feeling, this power I hadn't felt in so long. "She really hasn't spoken to you for an entire week?" Alexandra asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "And you don't even know why?" "That's the game," I replied, turning onto my street. "Guess the crime. Apologize anyway. Grovel until peace is restored. And you've put up with this because—" The question landed like a stone. Why had I? Why had I tolerated this endless cycle of punishment and control? Somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, even of self. "Inertia," I said finally, and a stupid belief that if I just kept trying, it would get better. She squeezed my thigh. The guy I knew wouldn't have settled for that. Her words hit harder than they should have. Because they were true. I'd chipped away at myself for years, until there was almost nothing left. But that ended tonight. When we pulled into the driveway, every light in the house blazed. Her silhouette passed behind the curtains like a ghost pacing in a cage. I checked my phone, 12 missed calls, 23 texts. The silence had cracked, but I wasn't the one who broke it. "Ready for this?" Alexandra asked, both amused and serious. "More than ready," I said, turning off the engine. We stepped through the front door. My wife stood in the hallway, arms crossed, rigid. Her face when she saw Alexandra, pure disbelief. Eyes wide, lips parted, frozen. "Look who I ran into," I said casually, helping Alexandra with her coat. "You remember Alexandra from the college reunion, right?" The silence that followed was thunderous. 1 minute. 2. My wife's eyes flicked between us, calculating, unraveling. 3 minutes, and still no words. For once, I was fine with the silence. Alexandra smiled, utterly unfazed by the thick tension in the room. "Your home is beautiful," she said, her gaze drifting toward the painting on the living room wall. "The artwork especially original." Her heels echoed softly across the hardwood as she moved with effortless grace. 5 minutes in, and my wife still hadn't budged, frozen in place, her silence no longer powerful, just paralyzing. I headed into the kitchen, pulling out 3 wine glasses. "Red or white?" I called out, voice light, knowing exactly what I was doing. "Red, please," Alexandra replied, now thumbing through the books on the shelves. "Oh, you have Fitzgerald's collected works. Remember how we used to argue for hours over his best novel?" 6 minutes. My wife followed me into the kitchen at last, her movements stiff, rigid with suppressed fury. I could feel her gaze drilling into my back as I uncorked the Cabernet. When I turned, the rage etched into her face was unmistakable, but still, not a word. Alexandra leaned against the doorway, utterly composed. "I was just telling your husband how much I've missed our conversations. No one challenges me quite like he does." And just like that, 6 minutes, 43 seconds in, everything cracked. "What is SHE doing in our house?" my wife snapped, her voice exploding into the space like shattering glass. The wine glasses on the counter quivered. I handed Alexandra her glass before turning to face her. Found your voice quickly, didn't you? Amazing what a week of silence does for the vocal cords. Her face flushed red. You brought her here? Into our home. I took a slow sip, held her gaze over the rim. I thought I was invisible. Or at least, that's the impression you gave me all week. Alexandra cleared her throat gently. Perhaps I should give you two some privacy. No, I said firmly, not breaking eye contact. You're my guest. You're welcome here. My wife's eyes narrowed into slits. You know exactly what you're doing. Do I? I replied, setting my glass down. Because for 7 days, I've had no idea what I did wrong. 7 days of punishment, of cold shoulders and locked jaws, without a single word. So please, tell me, what am I doing wrong now? Silence again, but this one was different. It crackled, charged with confrontation. Her eyes darted to Alexandra, then back to me. I saw the moment it registered. This wasn't her game anymore. She'd lost control. You did this to hurt me, she said, voice trembling with fury. You brought her here just to hurt me. Alexandra took a sip of wine, calm as ever, watching the unraveling. Her presence had done in minutes what I couldn't do in days, shatter the illusion of dominance. I stepped closer to my wife, lowering my voice. Hurt you? That's rich, from someone who spent the last week treating me like I don't exist. How's it feel, being on the receiving end for once? Her face contorted, composure cracking like glass under pressure. She slammed a hand against the counter. How dare you? You know why I was upset. I lifted an eyebrow. Actually, I don't. That's the problem. But please, enlighten me now that I'm suddenly worth speaking to again. Alexandra leaned against the island, quietly observing. Her calm only intensified the storm brewing across from me. I can't believe you'd do this, my wife hissed, voice low, shaking. You know how I feel about her. Yes, I said evenly. Just like I know how you use silence to punish. Funny how quickly you remembered how to talk once you saw someone else sitting in your seat. Alexandra tilted her head. You know, the silent treatment is actually a form of emotional abuse. It fosters rejection, isolation. My wife turned on her sharply. Nobody asked you. This is between me and my husband. Is it? I cut in. Because for the past week, there hasn't been anything between us. That was your choice. The room pulsed with silence, heavy and volatile. Alexandra, unbothered, sipped her wine like she was watching a performance unfold. And in many ways, she was. You did this to hurt me, my wife repeated, quieter this time, but no less bitter. I invited an old friend over for a drink, I replied. If that hurts you, maybe it's time to ask why. Her eyes darkened. Old friend? Is that what we're calling her? Alexandra gave a small, knowing smile. We go way back. Before you were in the picture. The words hit their mark. My wife's posture stiffened, and behind her eyes, the gears turned furiously. She'd banked on control, on silence keeping me tethered. But now, the rules had changed, and she had no idea what came next. You should leave, my wife said to Alexandra, her voice clipped, an attempt to snatch back some shred of control. That's not your decision to make, I replied calmly. This is my home too. Even if you've spent the past week treating me like a ghost haunting the living room. Alexandra set her glass down gently. Actually, I should probably head out. Early meeting tomorrow. She turned to me with that familiar, radiant smile. Thanks for tonight. It was great catching up. The way she let catching up linger, just ambiguous enough, was a gift wrapped in red for my wife's imagination. I walked her to the door, fully aware of the eyes burning into our backs. At the threshold, Alexandra pulled me into a soft embrace, lingering just long enough to make it unforgettable. Then she whispered in my ear, just loud enough to carry. Call me tomorrow. This was fun. When I closed the door and turned around, my wife was already standing there, arms crossed, fury emanating from every line of her posture. How could you disrespect me like this? The question almost made me laugh. Disrespect? That's rich, coming from someone who's ignored my existence for 7 straight days. Her voice rose, sharp and accusing. You were on your phone the entire weekend during my parents' visit. You barely said a word. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for me? And there it was. The grand reveal. After 7 days of psychological warfare, the unforgivable crime. Checking my work emails during a 6-hour marathon visit. That's your reason? I asked, incredulous. That's worth a week of silence? I told you before they arrived. I had an urgent deadline. You always have an excuse, she snapped. You never prioritize my family. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself. So let me get this straight. Instead of talking to me, you punished me. No conversation. No opportunity to fix things. Just 7 days of cold, calculated silence. That's not space. That's emotional manipulation. It's not manipulation, she insisted. I needed time. Needing time is saying so. What you did was freeze me out like a stranger. So yes, I brought Alexandra here tonight. Not to hurt you, but to show you how it feels to be erased. She followed me toward the stairs. Are you sleeping with her? I turned cold. You don't get to vanish from our marriage for a week and then demand insight into my personal life. Her voice trembled. Personal life? I'm your wife. Are you? I stopped on the stairs, staring down at her. Because wives usually talk to their husbands. Not treat them like background noise. Not dangle emotional intimacy like a prize for compliance. Her face faltered, the first crack. So what now? She asked, voice unsteady. You're going to see her again? To get back at me? I shook my head. This isn't about Alexandra. This is about respect. And tonight was about holding up a mirror. Letting you feel the rejection, the confusion, the humiliation. We stood frozen on the staircase. Something between us fundamentally shifted. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't on trial for a crime I hadn't committed. I wasn't begging for peace. I think we need to have a real conversation about us, I said at last. But not tonight. I'm sleeping in the guest room. As I turned to go, she grabbed my arm. Wait. You can't just. I gently pulled away. I waited 7 days to matter. You can wait until morning. When the sun rose, the house felt still, peaceful. I hadn't slept that well in months. Confronting the dysfunction, instead of dancing around it, had been a release. Downstairs, she sat at the kitchen table, clutching a coffee mug like a lifeline. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. We need to talk, she said quietly. Yes, I answered, pouring my coffee and sitting across from her, far enough to breathe, close enough to hear. Too often, these moments ended with her crying, me apologizing, and nothing changing. Not this time. You embarrassed me last night, she said. Bringing her here, it was completely disrespectful. I took a slow sip, let the silence stretch. Interesting, I said finally, that you open with what I did wrong. Not a word about your own behavior all week. That's different. Is it? I asked, voice even. Explain how. She shifted in her seat. I was upset. I needed space. Then ask for space. What you did was punish me. What you did wasn't space, it was punishment, I said, leaning in just slightly. Designed to make me suffer until I figured out what invisible rule I'd broken and came crawling back with an apology. She scoffed. You're exaggerating. It wasn't that serious. 7 days of silence. Of walking into rooms and being treated like air. Talking to someone who refuses to even look at me. I shook my head. If I had done that to you, would you call it acceptable? Her eyes dropped to her coffee. The silence that followed wasn't hostile now, just heavy with something closer to realization. Last night, I continued, wasn't about Alexandra. It was about holding up a mirror, letting you feel what it's like on the receiving end of your games. Confused, ignored, powerless. How did it feel? So it was revenge, she said, her voice sharpening again. No, I said evenly. It was clarity. Sometimes the only way to show someone the damage they're causing is to let them taste it themselves. I paused, choosing my next words with care. We can't keep doing this. These cycles, me tiptoeing, you locking yourself behind silence and wielding intimacy like a weapon, it's eroding everything we built. Her posture softened, the defensiveness giving way to something more vulnerable. I don't know how to communicate when I'm hurt. That's not an excuse, I said gently, but firmly. That's something you learn, if you want this marriage to work. She looked up quickly. And bringing your ex into our house. That's what, mature communication. I never claimed it was mature. I said it was necessary. A calculated break in a destructive pattern. And you're here now, finally talking. So yes, it worked. My phone buzzed on the table. Alexandra's name lit up the screen. Hope things went okay after I left. Here if you need to talk. My wife's eyes snapped to the message before I could flip the phone. Her jaw tensed. Are you sleeping with her? No, I answered honestly. But the fact that you assume I am, that says a lot about where we are. She shot up from her chair, pacing now. What am I supposed to think? You run to her the second things get hard. Difficult, I repeated, disbelief rising in my voice. You created this. You chose silence. You refused every attempt I made to connect. And actions, well, they have consequences. So what? You're teaching me a lesson by threatening our marriage. I exhaled. It's not a threat. It's a boundary. I won't live like this anymore. No more mind games. No more emotional punishment for crimes I don't even know I've committed. She went pale. The realization struck her. The cycle she'd relied on for so long had been broken. And I wasn't playing along this time. You'd throw all this away? She whispered. Just like that. I'm not the one who's been throwing it away, one silent day at a time. One manipulative week at a time. I stood, the space between us widening in more ways than one. I deserve better. So do you. But not like this. She reached for my hand, hesitant. I don't want to lose you. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. Then show me. Change. No more empty words. No more cold shoulders. Her voice cracked. And Alexandra was a catalyst. Not the problem. But my friendships aren't negotiable anymore. Trust goes both ways. I picked up my phone, pocketed it. I'm going to stay with my brother for a few days. Real space. Not the kind that punishes, just the kind that gives us both time to think. The shock in her expression said it all. You're leaving? I'm taking a step back, I said, echoing her own words from earlier. And the irony landed hard. When I come back, I added, we either rebuild this the right way, or we admit it's already over. Upstairs, I packed a small bag. In the kitchen below, I heard her begin to cry. The sound, once a trigger for immediate surrender, didn't undo me this time. Because love doesn't mean enabling what's broken. Sometimes, loving someone means refusing to keep breaking with them. It's been 3 months since that morning. 3 months of reckoning. Some of it raw, some of it healing. But all of it real. My week at my brother's stretched into 2. Time I didn't know I needed until silence finally meant peace instead of punishment. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without the constant pressure to decode someone else's moods. She called nonstop those first few days. Her messages swung between tearful apologies and bitter jabs. The old me would have caved at the first crack in her voice. This version of me didn't. I sent one message in return. I'll come home when we're both ready to have an honest conversation about what comes next. 2 weeks later, we met at a quiet downtown coffee shop. She looked smaller, less sure of herself. The woman who once wielded silence like a sword now struggled to fill it. I've been seeing a therapist, she said once we'd settled with our drinks. Twice a week. It wasn't what I expected. That's good. What made you start? You leaving? She traced the rim of her cup. I never thought you actually would. It made me realize how many people I've pushed away with these patterns. We talked. Really talked. For 3 hours. Probably for the first time since the honeymoon glow faded. She opened up about her childhood, about watching her mother punish with silence, how that became the language of conflict in her world. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped explain it. I moved back home, cautiously. We set clear terms. No silent treatment. Ever again. Counseling, twice a month. Open communication, even when it stings. Those first few weeks were clumsy, like learning to walk again after a long injury. But we were moving, slowly, awkwardly, forward. Then came the night she saw a text from Alexandra. Just a friendly check-in. Nothing more. But I watched the chill return to her face like a storm cloud creeping over the sun. For 2 hours, she barely spoke. Withdrawn. Distant. But this time, she caught herself. I'm feeling jealous, she admitted, voice low. Insecure. I know it's irrational, but seeing her name brought back that night. And how close I came to losing you. It was progress. Not perfection, but honest, vulnerable, human. Still, progress doesn't erase patterns. 2 weeks later, after a fight about holiday plans, I woke to silence again. The cold shoulder. The turn back. That subtle but familiar performance of invisibility. It lasted just a day, but it was enough. Some cycles don't break. They just tighten until you can't breathe. Yesterday, I signed the lease on a new apartment. Today, I packed a small bag, essentials only. I'd return later for the rest. Once the lawyers had sorted out the paperwork, I left a letter on the kitchen counter. No anger, no bitterness, just truth. I'd given the marriage one final chance. Set boundaries. Watch them get crossed. My phone buzzed as I laid the keys down. Alexandra's name lit up the screen. Still on for dinner? Found this great Thai spot. We had rebuilt something in the months since, slowly, cautiously. Just friends. Nothing more while I was trying to salvage what I had. But now the weight was gone. The door finally closed. Looking forward to it, I replied, walking out one last time. As I drove, the phone lit up with call after call. My soon-to-be ex, coming home to an empty house and a truth she hadn't believed I'd act on. I silenced the ringer. The hardest lesson I've learned? You can't force someone to respect you. You can only remove yourself from places where respect is absent. Leaving isn't weakness. It's strength in its rawest, most necessary form. That evening, Alexandra smiled as I walked into the restaurant. You look different, she said. Lighter. I feel lighter, I replied, settling across from her. Like I finally stopped carrying something I was never meant to hold alone. She studied me a moment. Any regrets? I thought it through. There had been love, laughter, a few golden moments scattered between the storms. But those moments had faded beneath the weight of manipulation and unspoken expectations. Just one, I said at last, that I didn't set boundaries sooner. She raised her glass. To boundaries, then, and to whatever comes next. I clinked mine against hers, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The simple, easy joy of being seen and valued just as I am. Not the start of anything certain, but the end of accepting anything less than respect. Some might call it cold or unforgiving. I call it necessary, because true strength isn't measured by how much you can endure. It's knowing when it's time to stop enduring and start living.